We are going to go ahead and get ready for our first panel. I'd like to introduce our moderator for the next two panels, Dr. Andrea Tharp. She works for the Department of Defense Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office as their highly qualified expert in sexual assault prevention. Please welcome Dr. Tharp.
Good morning. It is my pleasure to introduce you to the first panel of the session, which involves leadership perspectives on sexual assault and sexual harassment prevention. So I will be bringing up to the stage Dr. Mary Sue Coleman, who is the president of the Association of American Universities, Dr. Wayne Frederick, who is the president of Howard University, Dr. Jim Johnson, who is the president of the University of Alaska, and Vice Admiral Ted Carter, who is the superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy. Please welcome our panelists to the stage. So there's more information about the panelists' biographies in your program materials. For the panel, we'll have two questions that the panelists will respond to, and then we'll have a poll question and move to questions from the audience. So the first question, which I'll direct to Dr. Mary Sue Coleman first, is leadership engagement is a key component of sexual assault and harassment prevention. In your role as a leader, what steps have you taken to ensure consistent, visible, and proactive engagement on this issue? Please tell us of any significant successes or challenges that you faced.
Well, AAU, the Association of American Universities, has been really delving into this issue for quite a long time. Our presidents and chancellors came together 6 or 7 years ago and decided that they needed to really understand the basis and what was going on at all the member campuses. Now, the Association of American Universities is 62 universities, mainly the very heavy intensive research universities. There are 60 in the US, 2 in Canada. So first, as research universities, we really realized that we had to understand the problem better before we started to try to implement what we thought might be solutions. We do understand the problem, having conducted first, 6 years ago, a groundbreaking survey of over 150,000 students at 27 major universities, public, private, in many different states. Importantly, since 25% at least of the student population turns over every year, is new every year, education and prevention efforts must be continuous and long-term. Due to our survey, we know that new students are more vulnerable in their first semester than any time on the campus. We also know that LGBTQ students remain more vulnerable than any others during their entire time on campus. We know the intersection with alcohol abuse is critical, and that those who are standing by, their intervention can be very effective. Our presidents and chancellors are deeply engaged in promoting culture change and enhancing the orientation programs right in the beginning to try to tackle this issue directly and forcefully. All of our AAU members have streamlined reporting. We found out that students didn't know where to go to report. We've accumulated and analyzed data over time, and we have coordinated now both internally and externally. Our offices within the university are finally talking to each other. Now, in 2019, we have in the field right now a follow-up study of 33 major research universities, the results of which will be available in the fall of this year. This study will include information on graduate and professional students as well as undergraduates. Undergraduates were the focus of our original work. In addition, we formed a standing advisory committee, the AAU Campus Climate Survey Advisory Group, composed of selected individuals from our member institutions that will monitor our ongoing efforts to improve the safety and security of all on our campus. This isn't easy work. The target populations are constantly changing. However, we firmly believe that it is our responsibility to be vigilant and vocal about listening to our students and protecting them.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Frederick, would you please
Yeah,
go next?
thank you. First, let me thank the secretaries who are here and the superintendents. The servicemen and women of this country do an incredible duty to this nation. And as the father of a 14-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter, I want to express my heartfelt thanks for keeping us safe and keeping our country strong. So we appreciate what you do. This is obviously a very difficult topic, and I think as a president on a campus, this is one of the issues that you have to lead from the front. And so I came into this job after being the provost of the university. And as provost, I oversaw the Title IX program and was the final arbiter, as it were, when there were Title IX issues. The first time that I had to sign off on one of these investigations, I was given the documents of the investigation, given a letter basically to sign to send to the two individuals. Obviously, one person complaining, the other person being accused. And I felt extremely uncomfortable with the process because it was a process in which I would not have met either person. They would have received a signed letter from me with no other conversation. And so I did something that we hadn't done before, which was I requested to meet with both and to deliver the letter myself. And that was probably, I would say, the most insightful thing that I could have done, because what I immediately realized is that a lot of what takes place, the students want to be heard on both sides, and they want to be heard in a real palpable manner. And so we changed our process. We changed our process in terms of how we engage and how much the leadership was engaged. So every single person who complains and receives an adjudication meets with the provost directly, the very highest academic officer in the institution. And I think that that's a necessary step in terms of ensuring that students are heard on both sides of it. The second thing that we've done is we've launched a campaign called HU Stands. And it is a campaign to get everyone to take a pledge on campus that they are against sexual assault, against sexual harassment. And that campaign has been very aggressive. Again, the social media aspect of that campaign and the posters include all of my cabinet leadership, including myself, taking that pledge, and as well having a major kickoff event in which we actively took the pledge in front of the students as well. All of those, I think are things that you must do. But the environment is one that we must look at, and I think just as President Coleman had mentioned, the data must be something that leadership is familiar with. African American women are far more likely to be victims of sexual assault and far less likely to be listened and heard. By the age of 18, 40% of African American women have been subject to some type of sexual coercion. All of those are issues that are unique to the student population that I have, and therefore we must have a sensitivity given the population that we have. As a result, one of the things that we've also moved aggressively to do is to publish our data to the student body, to look for nodes of issues where they may be occurring, and the patterns are different. What occurs in my medical school is very different from what occurs in my school of business. And therefore, the other thing that we've recognized is that we've had to tailor our activities based on where the students and faculty and staff may be interacting. The other thing about the environment that I felt very strongly about when I took over at Howard, despite the fact that 70% of my undergrad students were women, we only had one woman dean out of 13. And while social justice is the DNA of Howard University, that clearly was a significant disparity that had to be closed. I'm happy to say that after 5 years, we now have 10 women deans of the 13, but that again comes from the very top. I insisted that we have gender bias committees for search committees. I insisted that everybody go to cultural competency, and as you can imagine, on my campus, sending faculty who are there because of their belief in social justice, the cultural competency training was not a popular thing. The good thing is that they all came back and agreed that they all had unconscious biases that they didn't know about. And that the other thing is I would not interview any finalists for any decanal job unless one was a woman. Again, that put myself out there. And obviously, the one thing that nobody on the search committee wants to do at an academic institution is to serve on it twice. And so it was very effective. We are yet to have a search committee send me 3 finalists without a woman who was well qualified, and that's why we've ended up with 10 deans. I mention that because the student body observes all of those things. They look at who the leadership is, and if they don't see the leadership reflected in who they are, they don't believe that you're going to take issues seriously. This is obviously not a gender-specific issue as much as I've focused on the fact that our leadership has to be women. The mention of LGBTQ issues was also important. I met with every LGBTQ association leadership head in the student body, and that was one of the most enlightening experiences I had, because the other thing that it brought my attention to was the fact that, especially when you look at the generational gaps and the cultural norms that have occurred in our society over time, we have a significant issue. So students who want to be referred by different pronouns, who are in a classroom with faculty members who've been there for 30, 40 years, you can't expect that to happen organically. There has to be some training, and there has to be some orientation around who the student body is and why some of these norms have changed. And that's the other thing that we've tried to do with the faculty when we bring the faculty back. We try to orient the faculty to the student body, which is not something that we've traditionally done. We focus on orienting the students, but we recognize now that you have to also orient the faculty as to who they are. And I'll close by saying that I live in a household, as I said, with a 14-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter, and I see every day how they interact. And this issue goes deep into our education system from the very beginning. My 12-year-old daughter refused to join a math club recently, despite her proclivity with math, because it was made up of all boys. And so after being cajoled by her teacher to intervene, I went to her and asked her why. And she said quite simply and matter-of-factly, "Dad, I don't like to work with boys because they take control, they mess it up, and then we have to fix it." She is both an attorney and an activist in my house. But again, it was very insightful. So what she did was she went ahead and convinced her school to form a women's club instead of having to go interact with the boys. That's not the ultimate solution, and we still are trying to push her to make sure that she can feel comfortable. But all of those things happen early, and for a 12-year-old to already have that insight about what the environment is around her means that we are not doing enough to stop this issue as early as possible so that it does not get into our colleges and universities. And then the last thing I would say is that I think we have an obligation as higher ed leaders to make sure that we're participating with our K-12 system as well, so that the students who are coming to us, we understand the environments that they're coming from.
Dr. Johnson, would you please respond next?
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here at one of our nation's leading leadership development institutions. Alaska is proud of its role in leading the nation in many respects in national security, in understanding climate change, and perhaps unfortunately in this area of sexual assault and misconduct. I walked into this role in September of 2015, and we are still in recession in Alaska economically, and our budgets are being cut, and we have the lowest college going rate in the United States, and this huge geography, and 16 campuses, 1,282 miles apart from our southernmost campus to our northernmost campus. So as I stood in the office on my first day, looked out the window, cranes and geese were heading south to winter over in warmer climes. They know it's going to come pretty soon in Alaska. And I looked out the window and I thought, okay, you're ready for this. It's going to be very, very difficult, but you're ready for this important role for our state. A knock on the door, and I looked around, and there was the general counsel and the chair of our Board of Regents. And I've known these people and liked these people, and I thought, wow, very nice. They're here to greet me on my first day. And I got rid of that notion real quickly, because the lawyer had a very thick binder under his arm, and he asked to shut the door. And then he told me about something they couldn't share with me before I took the job. Now, I knew that about 200 universities were undergoing compliance reviews by the Office of Civil Rights, Federal Department of Education, and I knew that the University of Alaska's campuses were undergoing that review. So it didn't surprise me, I guess, that they wanted to talk about this, but they said, when in response to OCR's review, we pulled 13,000 documents, and before sending them off to Washington, D.C., we read them. And we found some really concerning things there. Not only a lot of mistakes and a lot of negligence, but really some strong resistance to creating safe campuses and being transparent. And I said, wow, this is a big problem. What are we going to do about this? Well, of course, we're complying, and we'll continue our own investigations as well. So how long is this process going to take? Well, it's going to take 18 months, maybe 24 years. The federal government can move quickly in some things, but in these things they tend to, they're very deliberate. Let's put it that way. So, okay, 18, 24 months. And I said, so we need to talk about this, don't we? We need to take some action here. Well, yeah, but what are you thinking about? And I said, well, don't we need to go public? Don't we need to talk about this? Well, other universities haven't done that. They've waited for the compliance review to be done, and then they've announced the findings and that they've reached a so-called voluntary resolution agreement with the Department of Education. And then I asked, so who's going to be the guy at the press conference announcing this? It's going to be you. And that's going to be 18 to 24 months from now. Yeah? And I wager that the first question that's going to be asked is, when did you know about this? And what did you do about it between when you learned about it and today? And I sat there and I actually thought it was complex, of course, and difficult, but I thought, actually, it's pretty simple. And I quoted another gentleman who said the following in 1521. His name was Martin Luther. And he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." So I said, we're disclosing. We're going out. So let's get a crisis communications team in here right away. Let's get in touch with a congressional delegation in D.C. because it just happened that our senior senator was about to hold a hearing with the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in the United States Senate on how great her university was doing in this area. Senator, I think it'd be a good idea for you to not do that at this point and give it a pause and let us do our work here in Alaska. So within a month, we went public. It was a very difficult thing to do. It triggered all sorts of blowback. It slammed our reputation. It hurt our credibility in the short term. But we also, at the same time, set up hotlines. We brought in staff. We cleaned up the old cases. We did everything we expected they would make us do so that 18 months later, when it became, when we reached the voluntary resolution agreement, it was nothing at that point because we had quickly, thoroughly, and transparently communicated to all of our students, all of our faculty, and our entire state what had happened at our state's university. Going forward, I think that was a critical thing to do. We mandated training, particularly training for students, but by students for other students. This is something we engaged our student athletes in particular, because there is a high correlation there, unfortunately. So we brought those young men and women in, and they served a really important leadership role in communicating this across our university. Another thing I did during this time, which I would commend, is watching a documentary called Hunting Ground. And I don't know if any of you have seen this. It's very, very instructive. And I learned a couple things from this film. One is there were interviews of maybe a dozen or so university presidents. And they were all in their finery and their peacock suits talking about how they take this issue very seriously. And then after one, it would say, I'm going to make up the number, 190 cases, no expulsions. And then there's another president from a very distinguished university saying, we take this issue very seriously. 200 cases at this campus, no expulsions. And a series of these things. And so I learned not to say the following sentence. We take this issue very, very seriously. But the second thing I learned, because I'm slow, so I watched this thing a couple of times, and the second thing I learned coming out of the second viewing was that this is an incredibly difficult issue. This cannot be resolved today or tomorrow, but we must begin resolving it today or tomorrow, and it will take years. And it's going to take the persistence and the deliberation and the leadership, personal and professional, of everyone in this room and everyone on campuses all across the United States to resolve it. So I thank you for being here. I look forward to the next couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you. Admiral Carter.
Well, first of all, I want to say again, thank you for all of you being here. I am representing our 3 service academies as being up on this panel. And not surprising to any of you here, you know that our 3 service academies go through a survey with all of our midshipmen and our cadets. So here at the Naval Academy, 4,400 men and women, about 27% women, as we are now 42 years of having women on our campus here. Our survey participants, our midshipmen, it's about 80% actually take the survey. And then we publish these results. There are, to my knowledge, no other college or university that is exposing this much data to what's actually happening based on survey at our service academies. So there is this information out there. We are kind of in a standalone group that way, and we hold ourselves, as we should, to a very high standard. We get the best and brightest. These are congressional nominees that come to our service academy to go serve in the Army, the Air Force, Marine Corps, and the Navy. And what I would tell you is I don't think that we're any different than any other college campus. We're not immune from this problem. So we recognize, as we're all talking up here, that this is a challenge of our time. And I've been the superintendent here for 5 years. This is one of my top priorities. As we're all saying here, we care very much about this problem, but it's not just that. It's what are you actually doing? And this conference here is really not to take so much a backwards look at this. We're trying to look forward. What can we do on the prevention side to do better? And as we look at what we've done at our service academies, we now know there are some things that we're doing that are making some positive difference. The education part and how we impart this knowledge on our student body, which, as we've discussed, changes over 25% every year, has got to be right. Our midshipmen don't need me, a 59-year-old, older than their mother and father, to stand in front of them to tell them how to act. So we have invested in peer education through a program we call SHAPE, Sexual Harassment and Assault Prevention Education. We know that to be effective. It doesn't result in no events happening of unwanted sexual contact, but the midshipmen that do these surveys have told us that's been very effective. We also know that getting after the problems of alcohol are critical to this problem. Here, where we're next to the city of Annapolis, our brigade of midshipmen and the city of Annapolis are literally co-joined. Recently, we've made an effort this year to reduce alcohol incidents. We've made significant progress in that. And although I don't have the data to show what that result will be by survey of the change in unwanted sexual contact, we know it is having an impact. We have shown a reduction in alcohol-related incidents this year of nearly 50%. And we've done that through a more robust education program, another program we call Guardian Angels, where the midshipmen are actually out there in the streets of Annapolis protecting their own before something happens and bringing them back home here to Bancroft Hall where the midshipmen live. So there's a lot more to be done. We haven't moved the needle nearly as much as I would like based on our survey results of just the roughly 10 years that I have personally been involved, whether it be a fleet officer, president of the Naval War College, or being here for the last 5 years, or even the stand-up of what is now known as our 21st Century Sailor Office, an office that we stood up in 2013 to help go after some of these problems. So we are very interested in hearing more about what our other colleges and universities will be doing and how you would be willing to partner with us in understanding just the data that we have and that we have been sharing with the nation now going back 12 years. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, sir. So the second question is, one of the 3 goals for this national discussion is to build strong partnerships across many stakeholders represented here and beyond. Please share what you have done to develop and leverage effective partnerships in this space. Dr. Coleman.
Sure. Well, one of the things that we decided early on is that we wanted to make our data available, and each individual institution participating in the survey took their own data and either made it public or used it within the institution. But in addition to that, we deposited all the data from the 150,000 students that responded at the University of Michigan in the Institute for Social Research. So it is available there to all qualified researchers, basically free of charge. It isn't, publicly available, but if you're a researcher and you want to find out more about some subcategories or things that happen, I mean, one of the really important parts of this very extensive survey that we did was to help students define terms. That is, we wanted to know about sexual touching, unwanted attention versus rape. There was a lot of information in the media about the issues that students were confronting. So these data are available, and we hope that it will be useful for policymakers asking additional questions. And then when our 2019 survey gets completed, all those data will also be on reposit at the University of Michigan at the Institute for Social Research. So the other thing that this prompted, it's very interesting what happened with all the institutions when they really confronted the information that came back to them. And I think a lot of people were surprised, as perhaps you were, about the prevalence still about what was going on, is that we realized that there had been many different approaches within a big institution. I was president at the University of Michigan. It's a huge institution, and so there were a lot of, people involved in helping to advise students and counsel students, but we had often found out that they never actually talked to each other. And so we made it possible for students and recommended that all these offices get together at least several times a year to make sure that there's not that we wanted to put them all in one place. That was not the goal. Sometimes it's really important to have different services for different categories of students. But we actually wanted them to talk to each other so that they at least knew what was going on the campus. The other thing we found out, interestingly enough, through our survey, is that many times students did not know where to go. They didn't know how to report. Or even more troubling is they thought if they reported, nothing would happen and nothing would be done about it. And so we had to address all those issues about, yes, we take it seriously. There may be FERPA rules that say we can't be totally transparent about what we do with the perpetrators, but we should put those data at least in the form of anonymized data so that you can see that things are really happening on the campus. And that turned out to be extraordinarily important. We also made sure that we coordinated with law enforcement. Very often these cases do not end up with some sort of a legal component, but sometimes they do. And it turned out that the local police were not talking to the people on the campus. And so we thought it was extremely important for them to share data, to know what was going on. And again, that's another way that we actually partnered. We know that it's important for us to gain the trust of students. They don't necessarily trust the administration within their campuses. And so we need to reach out through our student affairs professionals to make sure that students know that we do take it very seriously. The other thing that I think was a real wake-up call for us is the realization that we have two parties here, and they're both important. I think, Dr. Frederick, you brought this up. It's the victim and it's the perpetrator, and they both need help. And we need to address that. They both need counseling. They both need to be taken seriously so that people don't get just demonized. They're retrievable. We are educational institutions. We ought to be able to educate to say we're going to change this aspect of our society. So what we discovered is that we did a second follow-up in 2017 after the original 2015 of just what our universities were doing. And what we discovered is that every single university, as part of the AAU, was doing something to change their policies to try to coordinate better, which was very encouraging to us, that people were listening, they were trying to do something, they were understanding that this was a societal issue, and that it was something that we had to address. You know, the other thing that I think it's important for us to keep in mind, and you've touched on this just a little bit, is that we need to vanquish this myth somehow that this just starts happening on university campuses and that they're somehow inherently the only place where it happens. It happens everywhere in society. It happens in K through 12. In fact, one of our interesting findings was one of our institutions reported that they had surveyed students what happened to them in high school before they came to the university, and they actually found out that the incidence in high school was higher than on the campus. So the students felt like they were safer coming to the university than they had been in K through 12. So this is part of this, I think, coordination and trying to share our findings and getting together to realize that it's going to be a long road, and it's going to have to really touch many aspects of what we do. But it's important for us to keep this work going.
Dr. Frederick?
Yeah, you know, I should be careful about saying this, but our universities are like flotillas, unfortunately. And so turning them around takes a lot of activity, and oftentimes we're trying to reinvent the wheel when there are best practices among us. So again, I want to commend conferences like this, because there are lots that is going on, and that partnership, I think, really starts at home. Howard is a historically black college and university, which is a designation from Congress that started in 1964. But these institutions have been around since the 1800s, as Howard was founded in 1867. I started a group called the HBCU Leadership Forum, where I brought all the university presidents from the HBCUs and their board chairs together for the purpose of us having conversations about what's going on our campuses and how we could try to solve problems. And what we've discovered from that ongoing meeting is that a lot of us are doing things that we just simply need to borrow from others. And I think that that has proven to be very effective. Title IX and the issues around that, how people are tackling them, is one of the myriad of issues in which that helps. The other partnerships that we have that I think are critical, which were mentioned, local law enforcement agencies, I think are very critical. So we partner with the DC government very strongly around our student orientation. DC has a very, I want to again be careful, has what I would describe as a little bit of a quirky law, in that if two roommates get into an argument, and as you can imagine on a college campus, that's not far from happening on any given day, whether it's from too much Netflix streaming of the wrong kind or too much drinking late at night, that turns into, it's a domestic violence issue if two roommates strike each other. And back in my day, all of us would have been in DC's jails versus being in college. Today, the law is different. And so as a result, we bring in the law enforcement for DC to talk about what those laws are that may be different, that students may not intuitively think about, that may govern some of this as well, because there is a legal issue sometimes embedded in this. We also bring in officials that talk about substance abuse, which we know has a very high correlation with the behavior, and we talk about that at New Student Orientation. On not this Saturday, but next Saturday, I will speak to the accepted students at Howard, and two things that I always mention in front of the parents are the conversations around this particular issue and that. So we have a parents association that we really try to make sure are engaged. Yes, you have young adults who are coming into ages where they're independent. Their FERPA rules suggest that we can contact their parents, etc. But the reality is the relationship with the parents is key. And I often tell parents when they bring their students that I hope you're not dropping your students off to find themselves, because it's an expensive way for you to find, for your child to find his or herself, but rather what you should be doing is what you have instilled in that young man or woman in terms of your own values. We are here to make sure there are no barriers to them fulfilling their potential. But that relationship between the parent and the student must continue and must be fulfilling, because oftentimes when something does go wrong, that is an easy line of communication. And if the parents are knowledgeable about what our rules are, you get a better partnership in terms of their ability to also call us and engage in the process in a way that they are not uncomfortable that we're not doing the things that we need to do, and I think it's critical. There are also several foundations that look at these issues and look at issues around things like suicide and that type of thing as well, because I think that the other outcomes that we don't often talk about are some of, obviously, the drastic outcomes that we're trying to prevent, and looking at the practicality of that as well. One of the notes on law enforcement as well, when you look at things like sexual assault kits, in DC, there's only one facility. Howard has a hospital on its campus, but there's only one hospital where the DC Metropolitan Police wants those kits to be done. So there's some practical issues that have to be looked at there. If a student shows up at our emergency room, we have to then transport that student to this other facility. And so looking at how those things are done and making sure that we're sensitive about that, putting a student in one of our police cars to go over there is even more trauma versus having someone who can accompany the student in an unidentified vehicle and at the same time be offering counseling is part of it. So partnering with other organizations where the student does not necessarily feel that all of his or her information is going to be out there is also helpful, and I think that those things are critical. And the last thing I'd say about partnerships, regardless of what interventions we come up with, I think we often have lost the idea that the human contact of the value of what that is. And I still think the most important partnership is to make sure that we're partnering with the students in treating them as individuals and treating their cases as individuals and not just looking at gross data. As I told you, that first case that I had to give the letters to, I brought both students in. One of the students was an athlete. And I said to both of them that when you come back to school next semester, I'd like you to come and check in with me just to make sure that things are going okay. And of course, with the busy summers that we have, I totally forgot about it until I got a call that this particular student wanted to meet with me. And sure enough, it was this young man who had been accused, although he was found guilty. He came back to check in with me because he felt that it was important to have that interaction. There is nothing that is going to replace the impact that that would have on him going forward, in meaning that he did his own introspection. He was responsible enough to think about coming back, and so you want to make sure you have that. So the other thing that we try to do is to bring alum into the mix, because oftentimes, as just mentioned, the students are a bit apprehensive about administration, and sometimes they may feel a little more comfortable talking to an alum or talking to someone who is familiar with the institution but not necessarily tied to reporting to me or reporting to another administrator. And I think those types of partnerships also help in terms of giving the students opportunities in groups where they can interact with others and feel more comfortable that they're not just being heard, but they also can rely on for support.
Dr. Johnson.
Thank you very much. We are trying to create a culture of respect at the University of Alaska, and when you talk about, ships and flotillas and they're moving slowly, when you have 16 campuses, 8 of which are inaccessible by land, 1,282 miles, it's kind of hard to do that. So those internal partnerships are critical, and it does take face-to-face. I have a leadership summit every single year, and it's about leadership development, but it's also about the critical issues of the day. Safety minutes for us now are not necessarily about trips and falls or air quality. They're about this issue. They're about campus safety, and that's an important emphasis. Police, obviously very important partnership there. The folks at OCR might be surprised to hear me say that that is an absolutely critical partnership between the university and the Office of Civil Rights. To try to get guidelines out of them is sometimes difficult, but critically important. When the Me Too cases came up, there were no guidelines for how to handle those old cases. What about the statute of limitations? What about? So once again, we said, well, let's propose something to them and see what they say. So we wrote a letter to OCR saying this is how we plan to take care of these old cases. And amazingly, within a week, we got a response. And this is to the Secretary of Education. And the week after that, I went back and sat down with her team and went through it. And they adopted those, approved those guidelines for handling Me Too cases. So critically important partnership there. Other institutions, and that's one of the great things I think AAU is doing, and I'm active in a group of the land-grant universities across the country, and we've made this a top priority. And another one, especially for this audience, you know, Alaska has a huge, percentage-wise anyway, a huge military population and presence. So we have Air Force bases and Coast Guard bases, I believe the largest Coast Guard base in the nation, Army posts. And so we reach out and work very closely with our military leaders because our communities are joined hip to hip. And so that's been critically important to make sure, you know, a lot of those soldiers and airmen and Coast Guardsmen are taking classes. Their kids are taking classes at our institutions, both face-to-face and online. And we think it's critically important to make sure that the entire culture, not just the culture on our campuses, but the entire culture is working in the same direction. Thank you.
I'm going to reframe this in a slightly different way to maybe think about this. And we're talking about partnerships to be engaged in the solution of prevention. The Naval Academy, and I know I'm speaking again for all of our service academies, we're complex organizations, and particularly the United States Naval Academy. We're only 32 miles from Washington, D.C. There is a constant spotlight on us here every day, and trust me, I feel it and I know it. So what I have come to know is for us to be able to operate, and I as a leader, the superintendent of the Naval Academy, I have to be able to engage not in what I would call partnerships, but spheres of influence. And there are many. This is a great example of a sphere of influence, bringing in experts, other college presidents, military leadership to address this. But here at the Naval Academy, there are spheres of influence, and they're not all the same size or weight. For example, parents of our midshipmen, that is a very major sphere of influence, and a group that I have to have this conversation with, because as we point out, many of these problems happen before our young people even came to our campus. Here at the Naval Academy, midshipmen spend the great majority of their whole year right here, so they have sponsor parents. This is a whole nother population of 3,000 to 5,000 families here at Annapolis that take care of midshipmen as a second set of parents or grandparents. Those people are critical to the weekend liberty and lifestyle of our midshipmen, so making sure they understand this conversation. And of course, on our campus itself, coaches, faculty, staff, they all have to be on the same page as not just what I understand for this problem to be, but how we're going to be part of that solution. I could go on and on. As you know, we have members of Congress. We, the superintendents of the Service Academies, have testified on this topic recently in front of the House Armed Services Committee. So they are an important partner, and they care a great deal because we house their constituents here from all 50 states. But maybe most importantly, and we should not forget, the most important influence group in all of this is our students, the Brigade of Midshipmen themselves, and how we engage them, how we have this conversation. I personally talk to that group as a total student body at least twice a year. And I don't miss that opportunity to have an adult conversation with them on this topic. It's a chance to calibrate them on the importance of this topic. So as we talk about partnerships, whether bringing in the subject matter experts or going to a place like the Aspen Institute for Higher Education and talk about other college presidents on this topic, we do have to be engaged in an almost everyday conversation with our most important spheres of influence.
So before we move to open questions with the audience, we'll do a poll everywhere question. So the question is, when you think of an engaged leader, what word comes to mind? So do they have the procedures for poll everywhere? As we wait for those results to come up, we'll start taking questions from the audience. If you have a question, if you can please move to the microphones at the side in the aisles. Okay, go ahead.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Goldberg from Columbia University, and I want to thank you all very much for being here and thank the academies for putting this on. It's really quite fantastic. So I have a comment and a question. One of the things I've been a law professor for a lot of years, but I became part of the senior administration of Columbia almost 5 years ago. And one of the things I do is oversee our work in this area, work on a lot of campus climate issues. And one of the things that struck me when I first came into doing this work, especially after having been a faculty member, is that I really didn't have much of a sense of what the university was doing for students. And what I learned was that we were doing a lot at orientation, and then like the AAU survey found, not a lot of information went out afterwards. So one of the things that we created is something called the Sexual Respect and Community Citizenship Initiative. And the idea is to give students some affirmative language, right, to talk about sexual respect and not just what you shouldn't do, and then to link it to the idea of community citizenship. And that is whatever one feels or whatever one thinks, whether a student says, well, I would never do anything like this, so it has nothing to do with me. The idea is we're all members of this community and we need to interact. And the other thing that we did was to do this initiative, which is required of all new students and encouraged of all continuing students. We do it during the first semester, so it's after orientation, after they've gotten through the blizzard and the chaos. And one of the reasons we do that is because my view has often been, you know, at orientation, we all know, right, the students are worried about, will they make any friends? They're not always listening to all of the very thoughtful things we say. So my question is for each of you is, how do you think about the work in this area after orientation, right? So when we think about the work that we're doing once students are getting into the day-to-day business of classes, how do you think institutionally, long-term and sustainable ways about engaging them, especially for the students who you know, for whom this isn't a priority, and for the students who say, yes, I would never do that, and then they move on to all of the other many important pressing issues that they're dealing with?
I think that's an excellent question. I think two things. One is that creating a culture on campus about how students are oriented around this, and faculty and staff, to be quite honest, is a constant daily, you know, engagement. The HU Stands campaign, I think, is an example of that, where we have a lot of social media engagement, where we're trying to meet the students where they are, about affirming what it is we are about and why we are about those things and how people can participate in that. We also have a series of events throughout the year to make sure that this is still at the foremost. Not so much, to your point, to be pushing information, but to be putting the topic out there so students are thinking about it. So for instance, the founder of the Me Too movement was on my campus just 2 nights ago. But we turned that into a half-day kind of symposium in which we had faculty members actually, from an academic point of view, present different types of ideas and work in different areas. And it included everything from women in the workplace to gender bias to the psychology of discrimination. So there was an academic component that drew the faculty in as well. And then by the time we had the keynote event at night, the students' participation was what I would describe as fulsome. They had an engaged day of that type of engagement. Usually in the spring, we have what's called a Spring Fest, in which we really focus on a variety of things. And again, we give this issue a lot of prominence. So I do agree with your point that you need to constantly do it. I will say one other thing is that you can't legislate behavior, right? Title IX is devised to prohibit, and it really tries to set you, I think, in a place where this is an issue that I think what the Department of Ed is trying to do is to get us to make sure that the culture is different. But there are two things about that culture. One, obviously, is you can't legislate behavior. But the second part of it is that to really change culture, if you have a bad culture, you have to change people. I'm convinced that you can't change culture without changing at least some of the people. And I mention that because in an academic environment, every 4 years or so, you have major turnover of who those students are, and then the adoption of technology changes it rapidly. So the other thing that I talk to my administrators all the time is that the last thing that we can do is use our own dating references as a starting point, right? Because, I mean, when I attended school, there was no email or cell phones, no social media, no Twitter. And now when you look at how students interact, that alone puts it in a totally different category. And by the time I'm finished having this conversation, there'll be something new that happened by the time we're finished with this that now puts it somewhere else. And so I say that as well to also recognize that a lot of introspection has to go into what exactly it is you're trying to feed to the audience, and recognizing that everybody's going to adopt it differently. My faculty need a very different mechanism to do that. They probably don't look at a single tweet that I send out, as opposed to my students probably don't look at a single tweet unless it has a hashtag that's catchy or something else. And so all of those, I think, are complexities layered into how you're constantly trying to communicate and change and create that culture.
I think it's creating a partnership, certainly with the top administrators. When I was at Michigan, had a fabulous, she's still there. I think she's here at this conference, Dr. Royster Harper, who is Vice President for Student Affairs, and who she's part of the student community in terms of her interaction with them. I mean, I think that role is so critical within the university to have somebody who really does understand the mores, the ways in which students interact. I love what you said about that, because if I went back to my college days, I mean, I would be shocked by the ways that students do things now, but it's perfectly fine. It's just that we have to adapt to it. We have to really understand kind of how they are interacting. I think big campaigns, we had one called Expect Respect, and this was a campaign across the entire university. I think it can be effective, but that isn't the only thing you can do. The residence halls are critical, making sure that the resident advisors are educated and understand, trained about what to do, what the expectations are, that students can actually, you know, they can defend themselves and say, well, no, that isn't appropriate, the way you're talking to me or whatever. It's all those things that have to be reinforced over and over and over again. And the top leadership of the university has to all buy into it. And I think students see that. They see that when there's a common message, they see when not only the Vice President for Student Affairs is speaking in some way, the Dean of the Medical School is same thing, same message, the President. I mean, it just has to infuse everything, and it can't be compartmentalized into some individual's responsibility. It's all of the leadership responsibility.
Yeah, I think in addition to what my colleagues have said, I think we have to live up to our cover story. Our cover story being our stated values, our high and mighty purpose, right? Growing leaders, truth, justice, ... you know, that academic institutions stand for. And often we don't live up to those high standards. And so, you know, let them know us by what we do, in addition to what we say. And students are very quick, and actually everybody is really quick to see hypocrisy and to see gaps in our adherence to our stated values. And so I think continuing to live up to those stated values every single day going forward over time will have a positive effect.
I'll just add shortly that the Service Academies have a slightly different timing and demographic. Most colleges and universities, the freshman class is arguably the most vulnerable to these challenges. At the Service Academies, that's generally not true. Being a freshman or a plebe, you're almost a protected society. Even though through the indoctrination and the early summer programs, there's an awful lot of education and training that goes on. That has to continue on, especially for our most vulnerable year, which is the second year, where they get a lot more freedom. We have come to know that we've got to focus on, really, I call them the big three. And this starts to get down to the tactical level, but I think it's a worthy discussion. We have to continue to focus on education on alcohol, what the issues of consent really mean to this generation through the various changes in social media and interaction and gender integration. And finally, what a healthy relationship looks like. That is changing in this demographic of this new centennial generation that we have in our college campuses. So that's a conversation in education that we have going on at every year at every level here at our service academies and at the Naval Academy. And finally, I'll just add that after some number of years of thinking about how to do this, we actually created a life skills handbook. You know, you might make the assumption that the best and brightest from the country coming to the United States Naval Academy already know these things. We find it to be actually not true. So we have actually formalized this in some of our leadership education through creation of a life skills handbook. And it is being very well received by the Brigade of Midshipmen.
Thank you. All right, we'll take the next question, and because we do have a number of questions and a limited number of time, if you could either direct your question to a certain panelist, or we'll just have a couple of y'all respond. Go ahead.
I'm Neil Malamuth from UCLA, and I was gratified to hear Dr. Coleman say that interventions and education should focus both on potential perpetrators as well as potential victims. However, the CDC, looking at all the current interventions throughout all universities, concluded that in general, when you look at scientifically sound studies, the interventions do not work except for bystander interventions. And we recently published a paper that concluded that for high-risk men, the interventions actually may be doing more harm than good. There are boomerang effects that are occurring potentially, and we were amazed at how few universities, if any, are doing formal evaluations, either formative or summative, of their interventions. Yes, there's attention to climate change, but there really isn't attention to how these educational programs are working and maybe doing more harm than good. And we proposed one to the University of California, and they chose not to do it. And I almost fear that people don't want to find out because they're afraid to do these evaluations, because the evaluations may indeed, if done properly, show that interventions are not working and may be doing more harm than good. And I wonder if perhaps comments about, do your institutions do these kind of formal evaluations with proper controls, and if not, why are you not doing them?
Yeah. So let me just try that. I'm delighted to hear that you're doing the work, because I think one of the things we talk about the most is how do we know, how do we evaluate? And I think it's complicated, and people don't necessarily understand what evaluation might look like. You have a perfect opportunity, because UCLA is one of our group, to help us with this advisory group that we're putting together that's going to be ongoing, looking at questions and how we can sort of, I mean, it's not only about collecting the data, and it's not only about understanding what's going on, it's the intervention part that we don't yet, and I understand we don't know how to get it quite right, but I hope that you'll participate, and I'll certainly tell them about your work and get them to reach out and learn more about it. Thank you.
I could certainly say that I'd like to chat with you. We have a lot to learn about what we're doing. I do know one number that I think is a real positive, although the public and our board thinks it's problematic, but I think it's a real positive, and that is a dramatic increase in reporting has occurred over the last several years, and I think that's absolutely fundamental. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Commander Carlos Brown. I'm from the Naval Inspector General's Office. Dr. Coleman, my question's directed to you. You presented an interesting approach in that we need to help rehabilitate both the victim and the perpetrator. That is contrary to what society may view as what actions might be acceptable. And understanding that approach would likely be met with a lot of resistance, maybe from the higher learning institutions, in addition to society's point of view. How could you see this being an acceptable and effective way, as well as getting buy-in from your higher institutions? And what do you think would be a realistic goal to use such an approach?
Sure. I think it's interesting that you say that, and I think that you're right in the sense that we are living in a time when people want to find, the bad person and punish them and shame them about how dare did you do this. But at the end of the day, the conversations that I've had, both while I was president at Michigan and now with all these universities, is that people understand that both are our students. We have a responsibility to both of them. And if we're true to our mission, that we're about education, that is our goal, and to have people live satisfying, fruitful lives, then it is our responsibility to try to help both of them. And I haven't seen a resistance within the institutions that I've been involved with. What the public thinks about that, at the end of the day, I don't really care, because it's about us and it's about what we're doing to try to help. I get the fact that it may be hard, that the sort of the campaign, the education that we're trying to do for perpetrators is difficult and maybe it's not effective, but we've got to try. We just have to if we're going to ultimately change the society. But again, it isn't as though I've found resistance. I have not heard resistance at any point in doing this work. I think people know it has to be done.
Good morning. My name is Chris O'Keefe. I spent the past couple years working in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and I also have a wife and 3 sisters-in-law who are all graduates of here, so this is kind of a fun, really personal and really personal place to be for this conversation. I'm curious, in the past couple years, particularly in the Bay Area, but across industry and the corporate world, we've had a kind of searing set of insights into our, the internal workings of how companies and organizations behave, and it's generally after the university experience, post, into the quote real world. I'm curious as to what dialogues you're having, because they don't seem to have as much of a coalition and a common understanding. There's no real alignment on how to approach things in the corporate world and in particular in the Bay Area. I'm curious, maybe if Dr. Coleman or maybe Admiral Carter, as you tie more into the direct military, maybe you could share some insights on how you might cooperate or how you are partnering or what they might take away from your lessons that you've learned in your research here.
Well, I'll start off, Chris. Good to see you. Full disclosure, Chris's wife, Ashley O'Keefe, was my aide when I first came here, so we obviously know each other quite well. There's no question that there's a linkage between what happens at a place like the United States Naval Academy and what happens after our midshipmen are commissioned as ensigns and second lieutenants and go into the Navy and the Marine Corps. And we are very interested, and we do get feedback from our fleet communities as to how our ensigns and second lieutenants and those that become lieutenants, how they're performing and how they do. There's no question that you highlight a point that there's no cohort that looks at in the civilian workforce, in my view, as to how we address this problem, other than these types of movements like Me Too. Obviously in the military, there's a tremendous amount of data on sexual assault and harassment that mirrors what we're doing at the Service Academies. It doesn't necessarily separate out our graduates, but there is a strong correlation to understanding how our graduates do once they get out in the fleet, and we are getting that feedback through the various communities.
I wish I had more ability to track what happens when students leave and go into the corporate world, private sector, whatever, and we just really don't. I mean, and I don't know whether there are associations of corporations that could ask the question, and I don't even know whether they're doing that, but I think it's an excellent point that if we could find a way, it would be a good continuation of the work.
So just briefly, I belong to a group called the Business of Higher Education Forum, which brings CEOs and university presidents together. And this is one of the topics that we kind of talk about, what happens in terms of that translation. Again, it's a smaller group, but clearly looking at what, how when we prepare folks for the workplace, we're looking at most of the technical things, but a lot of the soft skills, et cetera, then bring up this issue in terms of does that behavior then translate into there. And I think that's one of the, types of forums that exist in the country where that dialogue is taking place between CEOs and university presidents.
Hello, my name's Katie Conlin. I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, and I have 2 hopefully brief questions. The first being, What resources or programs do you have in place for long-term support of survivors of sexual harassment and assault? Because I feel like, in general, the support you tend to get is very short-term, but the implications and the burden that these victims and survivors bear is long-term and needs constant and more so community support. My second question is, in terms of the training that you are giving people, in my mind there are two types of perpetrators. There's the sexual predator who knows what they're doing is most likely wrong and is much more likely to be a repeat offender, and then there's the ignorant perpetrator, someone who really does not understand that they have violated someone's consent and doesn't know that they've done something wrong. And I think you can probably target them more easily with training, but do you have intentions and a way to parse that? And sorry, one follow-up question is, sorry, I'm a scientist, they trained me to ask questions. How is there an effort to include intersectionality into this training? So talking about how someone from different groups, be it a student of color, LGBTQ, someone with a disability, what barriers might be unique to that person in terms of coming forward or seeking help or what have you? That's all.
So I guess I have a short answer to your second question, which is no. And just to be very honest, that's a very complicated issue. And to be quite honest, I think if you think about it from a practical point of view, if any of us thought that we had someone who had sexually deviant behavior who was a perpetrator, I think ultimately we wouldn't want that person involved. I do want to lay on some of the prior comment that was, in terms of the question that was posed to Dr. Coleman. One of the reasons why some of the rehabilitation around perpetrators is because of the issue that you just mentioned in terms of ignorant perpetrators. And obviously at college and university level, you do want to try your best to rehabilitate, because we do it in almost every other fashion, right? There are other things that we're concerned about. Some of them are just simply social things, like we don't want students to be tardy, we don't want them to look unkept when they go to business. I mean, there's some social norms that we're trying to get students to appreciate, and students who have their, who come from environments where their parents were waking them up every morning to having to be responsible. I mean, regardless of how complex or simple it is, there is a type of rehabilitation that we do want to put in. In terms of long-term, we do have support groups that we try to encourage the students to attend, and you're right, the long-term is part of it. One of the things that I've asked my Title IX office to look at recently is there a change in the graduation rate of students who complain and students who were accused? Is there a difference in the time to graduation in terms of that performance? Is there a direct correlation with academic performance the very next semester? And does that get better or worse with time as well? And those are all data points that we're collecting internally and then trying to link it to the type of concern that was initially brought forward in both sets of, whether it's a perpetrator or otherwise. I think we have to tie back to, I think, another comment that was made from the gentleman from UCLA. We have to tie our interventions to those outcomes and really try to make sure that we're not doing things that make us feel good, but we're doing things that have strong outcomes. And obviously, that does require some research and some time in order to get there. But we do have longitudinal support group interventions that continue for the time that the student is there. But I have to be honest, I don't have good data to suggest whether or not those really work and whether or not what impact the short-term interventions have.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the wisdom you've shared. My name is Dr. Jay Goosby-Smith, and I'm Assistant Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Citadel and an Associate Professor of Management with a research area of inclusion. More importantly, though, I'm co-director of our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center. And one of the things we've learned in that center is how important it is for people to humanize each other and hear each other's stories and actually see each other as human and not see each other as those people. And so one of the things that I've read and looked at with sexual harassment and assault is, in some of the cases, it's a lot of objectification of seeing people as those people, and they're not really seeing the person that they're allegedly perpetrating the assault against as a human being, as their sister, as their brother, as their friend. And so I'm curious to know if there are any efforts on your campus that help people to actually humanize each other, which is a huge societal issue. And secondly, I just wanted to co-sign the importance of intersectionality, because that's part of the humanization process of seeing people as actually individuals. So I'm curious if there are any things on your campus that engage in helping students to actually humanize each other and stop the objectification, which is one of the undergirds of sexual harassment and assault.
Yes, it is a constant effort to make sure that students are actually seeing each other as human.
Are there any concrete things that you're...
Well, just through many interactions, we have had a program at Michigan called Difficult Dialogues, and sometimes you plan these to bring together people who may think LGBTQ. Well, how can we possibly have those conversations? Well, sometimes you have to organize it, and sometimes you have to plan it. And as I said, the Vice President for Student Affairs is critical here, but working with the whole team of people to make sure that we're thinking about those issues around the campus and what are going to be the really flashpoints. I mean, in Michigan, we had an interesting situation because we had a large Arab American population in Dearborn, a large Jewish population in the students. That takes thought about how do you get students to talk about things that they may feel without seeing each other as enemies. I mean, it's a constant challenge, and I was appreciative all the time about the thought that went into trying to arrange those interactions that people could see each other. Having days where student groups come from, whether they're the squirrel lovers on campus to the students who are doing Arab American food, or these kind of festivals where you bring everybody together. It's out in a big open place on campus. You can visit booths. You can talk to each other. Those are all humanizing kinds of experiences, and that's what we do at campuses. It's really important.
And as we know, this is the last comment, we as faculty often are part of the problem. So are there any things you're doing to address these issues with faculty?
Sure. Trying to get faculty to have sort of interactions with those students, having small seminar groups where first year you can have a class with no more than 13 students, and they talk about their background and their lives, and the faculty are there sort of hosting those conversations. So of course, constantly trying to make those interactions.
Super questions. We just had a really interesting, problematic case of the missing stair problem, where an academic department put up with an abusive faculty for 30 years. Now, he retired last year. We just finished up the investigation because there were so many complainants. Now, he's been, what can you do then? Well, one is you can take some actions at that point. So there's not only the what we should be standing for and what we should do, which is really, really a positive thing and important. But when there's a problem, we need to take action. And unfortunately, often in our institutions, we sign agreements and we say goodbye, and everybody seems to be okay, when in fact, everybody really knows that that guy was a jerk. And so in this case, we, of course, are going to abide by the law and all of that, but I think it's pretty clear. I mean, not going to get emeritus status, not going to be on campus, and we're actually informing people that we don't want to, that they should not see him on campus, and if they do, raise their hand, and we'll take care of that.
Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sophia Bouchelier from Stony Brook University. I think one of the reasons why we're here is because of decades of feminist research and activism to make violence against women, sexual violence, and gender inequality sort of into the mainstream consciousness. But I haven't, a little bit around Howard's activism around gender equality and leadership, and inviting Tarana Burke, et cetera, but I haven't heard the rest of you mention feminism at all, and I'm wondering, how do you engage with feminist theory and activism in your works to try and end sexual violence?
I'll take some of that on. As I mentioned earlier, in the generational movements of having women on college campuses, the service academies are relatively still new at this. We didn't bring women to the service academies till 1976. I was here with the second class of women in 1977, and we're talking less than a couple percent of women. So there was this overwhelming challenge of them ever feeling accepted. And I have this theory that the service academies move in generations that take about 7 or 8 years to get to another level of gender integration. So we're in about our 5th generation of just even getting used to knowing that women, even though they're a minority, they're no longer an exceptional minority. In other words, they're over about 25%, here at the Naval Academy, 27%. We have now expanded this into not just making sure that women feel accepted and that they're surviving, they're actually thriving. And we're seeing this in almost every measurement, and we do measure everything from academics to physical mission to the moral side of the mission. We now have brought in alumni groups to bring in what we call influence groups. So this is a group of women that have either served in the Navy, the Marine Corps, most of them Naval Academy graduates, and now they're advocating and having a conversation with our women that are here on campus. We have a women's network here as well. And this isn't groups that are just formed of women. These are our young men that are here also, and they're having real conversation. Sheryl Sandberg came here some 6 years ago and coined the phrase lean in. That was done here at the Naval Academy. So we have created various lean in circles to have other meaningful conversation, and those are maturing and getting larger and larger every year. So we're very engaged in this open, frank dialogue to make sure that everyone, men and women, know how they fit, how they interact, what the culture is, something that goes well beyond just the phrase of dignity and respect.
Really important discussion, but just in the interest of time, we'll take the last question.
Hello, my name is Pat McGann. I'm the Director of Strategy and Planning for Men Can Stop Rape. And for many, many years, really sexual assault and sexual harassment have been seen as a women's issue. I think there's still a lot of ways in which that is the case. And if you look at college campuses and who make up peer educators, it's typically a lot of female students, and it can be hard to attract men to do that kind of work. So the question I'd just like to ask is, what on your campuses are you doing to specifically help the men, and I mean faculty and students and administrators, see that this is a men's issue?
I think that's a great point, and I think tied into the last speaker, or the last questioner, sorry. I think one of the things that I often tell people, I get invited, as you can imagine, to talk about diversity and inclusion. I've been to almost every intelligence agency in DC, except the CIA. Because obviously, people look at Howard and its history and they think, well, that's the workforce that those are the graduates we need to go after. My litmus test for whether or not an organization is serious about this topic, so whether it's sexual assault, sexual harassment, or diversity and inclusion, is who the audience is when I show up. So if every black employee is in the audience, I immediately tell whoever invited me that, you're just wasting your time, you're ticking a box, because the people who need to hear about it aren't in the room. Right? And it's the same thing with sexual assault, etc. So what I try to do on our campus is to make sure that we sensitize everyone when they're doing their programming to target the audience that you need to get there. So I'll give you an example. We have a Women in STEM grant on my campus. The first few events I went to, all women. I did a study to look at how many women get promoted versus how many men. The percentage of women who were getting promoted was less than the men. And when you look at the committees, the APT committees, they were made up of mostly men. So I went to the PI, the co-PI of the grant, and I said to her, I'm just curious, who do you think prevents the women from getting promoted? And so she, of course, flippantly said the men. I said, well, why is all your programming focused on just preaching to the choir? Why don't you insist on getting the men there so that they can be sensitized to the issue? I'm happy to say that last year, a greater percentage of women who applied for promotion at Howard got promoted than men. So now the men are going to complain, as you could imagine. But you have to target that audience. And I think you bring up a very, very important point. This is not a woman's issue or man issue. This is a human issue. It's about human interaction. And that is the last point that I want to make. I intend to teach a class to my freshmen this coming fall, and the title is probably going to be Nice. Because I think we live in a society today where the issue of how we interact with one another has just gone completely out of what we think is important. And it's not cool to talk about it. It's not accepted to talk about it in bigger circles. And for all of the things that we talk about in these 2 days, I hope that the one thing that we would take away is that if all of us just take our time to interact with someone with respect and dignity, every single interaction, a lot of these problems wouldn't even exist.
Thank you so much. What a great way to end the panel. Thank you for all of your insights. Thank you.
It's approximately 10:10. We will take a 20-minute break and start promptly at 10:30. For the purpose of this break, please, if we could exit out of these doors. Thank you so much.